Okay, I think it has ticked over to our official start time. So first of all, let me again go through the housekeeping real quick. Thank you everyone for joining us for the Drupal.org panel. If you need captioning for this session, we do have captioning enabled for myself as the main speaker on the slide deck, and hopefully you're seeing that on the screen share. However, because this is a panel discussion, it's very difficult to get the other voices captioned, so please try and turn on the Chrome Accessibility Live Captioning feature. The instructions are pinned in the chat if you need and rely on those captions. That will really help out. And please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We've seen tons of people from all over the world joining us today, which is always wonderful to see. And yeah, let me speak a little bit to who's here and the format and what we're going to be talking about today. So the Drupal.org panel is something we do at every DrupalCon to talk about Drupal's infrastructure and what we do collectively to help build the tools that help the community build Drupal, as we love to say. So on screen in front of you, you see the different members of the engineering team and Rachel, our community liaison, the DA staff across that top row. On the bottom row, you see two faces, one Narayan Newton, who's with Tagwin Consulting and helps with infrastructure for Drupal.org, and Michael Hess from the University of Michigan, who's part of the security working group and also an infrastructure volunteer team member. These panels about the Drupal Association engineering team have historically been kind of a survey of highlights, the recent work we've done on Drupal.org, what the work that's upcoming. But we're going to do things slightly differently this time around. We're still going to talk about past and future projects, but we're going to do this in a little bit more of an informal conversational interview style. I'll still have some slides to help guide the discussion here. But without further ado, let's dive on in. Talking about infrastructure, as I said just before the session started, the Drupal Association runs Drupal.org's server hosting environment at the Oregon State Lab in Corvallis, Oregon State Open Source Lab in Corvallis, Oregon. And we also partner with Tagwin Consulting for infrastructure management and support, who really help us keep everything up and running. As you can imagine, since we had some hiccups just this morning, we really have been working on getting everything up and running. So if you were having trouble with getting onto Drupal.org itself or the event's schedule or any of that kind of stuff, it should all be back up and squared away. But we're keeping an eye on that throughout the event. And so a few quick highlights before we get into kind of the conversational portion. The first one that I'd really like to talk about are the notion of general projects, which have just recently been enabled or on Drupal.org. So what are general projects? How do these differ from contributed projects or that already exist that you might be used to? On Drupal.org, historically, if you're a project maintainer, you can submit a module, a theme, a distribution, these different kinds of projects that let you say, hey, I want to extend Drupal in these various ways. And just recently, we enabled the ability for what we're calling general projects. So these general projects can be all the things that don't fit into those other buckets. So they don't have to be PHP code bases that are configured as contributed modules. They can be things like JavaScript libraries or Drush extensions, to Benji's point in the chat, or things like that. Having enabled these projects, what this lets us do is begin to extend the ecosystem of contributed code on Drupal.org beyond kind of the PHP layer of Drupal. So as Drupal itself becomes more, embraces decoupled solutions, JavaScript frameworks, JavaScript front ends, we can now start hosting some of those libraries. So this first example of the Once.js library was created by the Decoupled Menus Initiative, one of the main initiative teams that's being highlighted this week, and is now hosted on D.O and is the first D.O hosted project to publish to NPM. So that's one of the exciting highlights coming into this DrupalCon. Another one that I wanted to just touch on briefly is we've had some great opportunity recently for cross-project collaboration with other open source projects out there in the ecosystem. So, for example, as part of the Automated Updates initiative, we've worked together with other PHP CMS projects like Typo3 and Joomla, and with some related technology projects like the Composer project and the Tough project within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, to lay a common framework and a common groundwork for how we're going to secure update packages that get delivered when we're implementing automatic updates. So this has been just one of those opportunities to actually reach out, to get out of the Drupal bubble, off the Drupal island, and talk to contributors in other ecosystems and get on the same page. And it's just a nice reminder that we are all part of a larger open source movement. Finally here, just before we get into the actual kind of conversational section, I'd like to talk about merge requests on Drupal.org. So since, as many of you hopefully know by now, you can actually use issue forks and merge requests to contribute on Drupal.org. So that means in any Drupal.org issue, there is now a button that lets you open a forked workspace where you can work on that code and directly use the Git Lab interface to make any changes and then open a merge request. So since we've enabled that feature last year, towards the end of last year, almost 5,000 merge requests have been opened. Nearly half of those have been either merged in or closed because another solution was selected. And about 550 of those were correlated, with about 100 of those resolved since being opened. So we've seen really fast adoption and take-up of the new tooling features. Hopefully, most of you here on the call have had a chance to try that. And if we have some new folks here who have not contributed before, I hope you'll find this a much more easy-to-use contribution experience. To speak to some of the chatter that I'm seeing in the chat right now, you no longer have to generate patches for your contribution. You no longer have to use the command line. You shouldn't need a local development environment even, because we also have features to say, give you a live preview of the code changes you've made and all those sorts of things. It's really pretty exciting. So for our first discussion topic, I kind of want to lean further into what we've been doing with Git Lab and kind of what the progress is right now and what kind of upcoming plans we have. So Neil, I think I'll start talking to you a little bit about this. Ever since this launched, we've had folks in the community providing us feedback, helping us make it better, making some feature requests. Can you talk a little bit about what we've been doing since the initial launch to kind of polish the process up?
Yeah, so what we're doing right now is really driven by the general projects. Since the general projects, they have different ways of being tested than a regular module with Drupal CI, and different requirements like being published to NPM. So we're getting the GitLab CI, GitLab's continuous integration enabled for the general projects, and some other GitLab features that kind of come mostly for free, like the wikis and pages and snippets. And so that people can manage those, we're also getting into allowing maintainer, what GitLab calls maintainer access. We had given out developer level access to everything, and maintainer access gives you access to set variables and put secrets into GitLab CI. We still have to be careful about that because it conflicts with some of the stuff that Drupal.org needs to manage, like the name of the project. We don't want maintainers to rename their project. Yeah, we're working on pages and snippets, getting those, figuring out how to get those hosted.
Yeah, so, oh, go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, and we're also doing some ongoing improving our GitLab integration. So There's a lot of stuff like ongoing maintenance that just comes up that we don't expect, such as needing to rebuild our staging environment for GitLab due to some disk space requirements and needing to move that to a different VM. So yeah, there's always going to be ongoing maintenance. We upgrade GitLab at least twice a month to keep up with their security releases.
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil. And maybe that leads me to some questions for you, Ryan, actually, which is related to GitLab and CI. We just heard Neil say that we're looking at enabling CI for general projects. What does using GitLab CI as opposed to Drupal CI actually mean, and sort of what's our plan for the future around the way CI will work for the Drupal project?
Yeah, so Drupal CI has been what we've been using to power everything on Drupal.org, all of our projects and core testing and development, and it's had some constraints around it as far as well, we've got to do as much as we can with as few resources as we have available, to focus on cost savings and ways to do it. And so a lot of how we've managed Drupal CI in the past has been very centralized and very these are the choices you've been given, these are the stuff that you have available to you, you could pick from this menu of things. But more and more developers are used to the Travis and Circle and GitHub Actions sort of model, where it's almost like you're given free rein to do whatever you want to with it, and it's up to the developers to do what they need to do. Now, that has been sort of in conflict with us trying to save money, because we don't want people to be like, I'm going to install my Bitcoin miner on our infrastructure. So we're looking at rolling it out slowly and figuring out how to make it so that there's the right balance between providing tools for the community in a standardized, best practicey sort of way versus here's just an open YAML file, do what you think is right, and have people be like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? And so we're rolling it out slowly through the general projects and letting them kind of experiment with things and figure out what those best practices are, coming up with ways to have templated files that we can use to provide people to be like, if you wanted to just do basic testing, here you go. And also coming up with a way to take the images that we have now and the system that we have now and convert it over to running on GitLab, so that we can actually run, strangely, Drupal CI on GitLab's runners. And so that's sort of the next step, so that we can provide a transitionary period, so we can say, well, there's not two systems in place, it's really just one system, but this is just one way of running it. And so that's sort of what we're looking at as well. So because we want to transfer over from using the EC2 instances directly to using Kubernetes, which is what GitLab uses behind the scenes. And so once we're able to do that, then we'll have kind of the incremental steps towards being able to have GitLab as the main tool and opening things up that way.
Awesome. Cool. There's a question in chat. You sort of spoke to this very briefly, but when it comes to managing the kind of resources that we make available, do you have, I know it's early because we haven't gotten into this yet, do you have a sense of how we might do that in terms of, do we just give each project X number of hours of testing, or do we try and give them predefined images, or what's the level of control we might be able to have, given the limitations of
I mean, I think the thing that we're going to have to do is just sort of monitor what people are doing with it and see how much time they actually are using, because the kind of the two sides of this coin are, core takes up a lot of time in their testing, and they test a lot of environments, they test a lot of things, and the tests take a long time, and that's 80% of our costs. And so on one hand, opening up to Contrib to do whatever they want is a little worrisome, but on the other hand, opening up to Contrib to do whatever they want is like, well, Contrib tests actually run pretty quickly, so maybe they just add in 10 new steps that all add another 5 minutes to their builds, and that's actually not that big of a deal. So that's sure. It's sort of a let's wait and see what people do with it and monitor how much time things take. And it might be that we have to limit the number of minutes available to a project, or it might be that we have to just work with particular projects to be like, hey, you don't need to test every single database and every single version of PHP and every single environment on every single patch. Like that's sort of the
Right.
kind of working back and forth with people.
Sure. I see a couple questions here. I'm going to answer a few of the ones in the Q&A that are GitLab related at the moment, and then I see some other questions that I'll try and get to as we keep going where they fit in. One is, how closely have we watched sort of the Drupal spoons thing, and is its GitLab integration, can we learn from the way they do GitLab CI to the way we should do GitLab CI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually been working with Moshe, who set up the Drupal spoons, to kind of help me take what they've learned from how to, because he ran into sort of the same sort of problems of like, how do I set up a thing that gives everybody a starting point that's an equivalent starting point? And so, yeah, so I definitely worked with him on this general project to figure out how we could kind of take what they've learned and apply it to what we're trying to do for the rest of the community. So.
Cool. And I'll say also related to Drupal spoons, there is, as you can see here, we're talking about moving away from sort of Drupal CI as a home-built CI system to using GitLab CI off the shelf. We're enabling other features like snippets and wiki. By looking at the Drupal spoons projects and how they've sort of succeeded, it helps us figure out what we can begin to turn on and move our own D.O integration more and more into using sort of off-the-shelf GitLab features where possible. So let's see, I'm going to keep going here for the moment and skip us on through. One of the other features that you may have had a chance to use and hopefully you have quite enjoyed are the live deployment previews. So we have a partnership with Tugboats.qa, who are a sort of spin-off organization, partner organization of Lullabot, to enable these previews. So these were first made available on Drupal core issues, and they're now also available for contrib maintainers to set up their projects to be able to use them. There's some documentation on Drupal.org for that, and there's members of the Tugboat QA team who are setting up in the contribution area a sort of contribution table where they will help maintainers get their live deployment previews set up. So just for those who haven't seen these, what you'll see when this feature is enabled for a particular project is you'll see on the given issue fork or branch the View Live Preview button, kind of the link showing up underneath the branch that'll let you go in and get those set up and working and preview your changes. And this goes back to what I said before about wanting to be able to enable people to complete a contribution cycle entirely in browser without command line tools or local dev environments. When you click that link, a suspended preview gets sort of regenerated based on some base images, gets up and running, and you can see a Drupal.org site with those changes applied from that branch. So it's good both for validating kind of the code changes that you may have made yourself. It's great for people reviewing your contribution, and it's awesome for accessibility and usability experts to be able to go in and not have to set up some local dev environment just to be able to give accessibility feedback or usability feedback on a particular change. Let's see, Neil, do you have more to say? Perhaps you worked closely with some of the team over at Tugboat to get this integrated. Any other comments or thoughts on the live deployment previews?
Yeah, not really. Those things where it's a straightforward service and it's for the most part just works. There are instructions for getting your contrib module enabled with this. If you are a contrib module maintainer, it does require having a configuration file committed to your Git repository for your project.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, great. Let's keep moving because I may have overloaded the number of topics I wanted to talk about given the time we have. Let's talk briefly about what it takes to deploy a new production service for the Drupal Association engineering team. And this could be a much larger conversation. I was going to borrow Narayan from the Tag One team, but of course he's still cleaning up some things from this morning's outage issues. As you've hopefully heard either in our blog posts or at a previous DrupalCon, Drupal Steward is a web application firewall service that we're offering to help protect sites in the gap between the release of a security fix and the time it takes to actually patch your site and update. So we're working with partners who are protecting their sites on a platform scale. So for example, we're doing that with both Acquia and Pantheon. And we're also working with individual site owners. However, to date, as of today, you have to contact basically myself directly in order to kind of get onboarded and set up. And we've been recently working on a self-service portal where you can actually sign yourself up, configure as many domains as you need, and get everything up and running. So this is just a sort of lorem ipsum screenshot of what this new kind of page for the service is going to look like. But I thought it would be interesting at least to spend a few minutes talking about like what it takes to actually run a new service and what all the sort of considerations are involved. To kick things off a little bit, this is actually a Laravel app that's been developed and that we're going to be hosting in order to kind of run this sign-up service, and that integrates with some key service providers on the back end that kind of make everything operate. But just sort of taking an application and standing it up as an actual production service requires some deep thought and some care. So just to talk about this again super briefly, maybe we can start, Neil, with you. What is it like taking kind of an application code base and then trying to review and figure out what it needs to make it ready for production on D.O?
Yeah, this is kind of a greenfield project for us. So we're trying to start from the most, the current modern development DevOps best practices. And yeah, this year that means containers. And we're spending extra time doing security auditing and along the way also accessibility auditing and everything else we know how to do, since this is a CDN basically in front of your sites. So if it gets compromised, potentially every site could be compromised. So we're making sure everything is secure, updated, auditing the code bases, auditing the containers, making sure our sources for those are easy to update, and whoever's maintaining the containers and the whole supply chain, they get updates done in a timely manner. We're using Ahoy to script tasks, basically. So, we have the deploy scripts and all of the other workflow things scripted and reproducible. And we're using GitLab.com to build and deploy, host our build and deploy pipeline. So that we can get a little more familiar with GitLab, those type of features, and keep the hosting of that isolated from other services that we run.
Yeah, that service isolation is fairly important because we wouldn't want an outage in one kind of aspect of our stack to prevent us from, say, deploying a security fix on a completely unrelated application or something like that.
And also, to get a little more ahead of the Laravel question, there's another customer of the same CDN provider. We're not building a CDN from scratch that had basically the same requirements. So we're using the same code base.
Yep, taking advantage of some existing work and some great contributors there. So if you're interested, partners that we are working with on that front are Section.io and Quant CDN. They've both helped us out in the process of actually creating Drupal Steward as a functioning product. So if you're interested in this for your sites, your client sites, or going back to your team to talk about it, again, we will be launching the self-service portal sometime soon. It won't be during DrupalCon, and it won't be immediately following DrupalCon, but we're getting pretty close. The pricing works out to basically $15 a domain with a certain amount of included requests, and then a charge for basically an overage charge for additional requests that hit this service. There is discounted pricing available for supporting partners of the Drupal Association. This all works out to being really quite affordable. It's between like 20 and $60 at the most for a globally distributed CDN-like service, acting as a sort of web application firewall in front of your sites. So,
yeah.
Yes. To continue through, let's talk briefly also about kind of another project we support, which is getting the community ready for Drupal 10 readiness. So this is something that's being driven forward by both by Palantir.net and Acquia, among the other kind of individual contributors. So Palantir has worked on and contributed to Drupal Rector, which is the tool that helps create automatic patches for deprecated code usage. It's been really, really valuable, and it's part of what made the 8 to 9 upgrade so easy, and the process of module maintainers being able to update for compatibility so much easier than it otherwise would have been. So if you haven't checked that out before, I really recommend that you do. And Gabor at Acquia has also used some data that we've helped to provide upgrade status information. So upgrade status information is available in a module that you can install, but is also available at a site that Gabor hosts and gives us sort of ecosystem-wide information about code readiness for modules in the Drupal ecosystem. So Ryan, you've worked a little bit with Gabor on this system. Can you talk about sort of what it is, why we use it, and what's involved in supporting it?
It started with the Drupal 9 readiness as a hey, we're about to launch Drupal 9. How far along are we? Which modules are close? Which ones are really often used that are close? How quickly is the ecosystem catching up to this new version of Drupal 9? Because the ultimate problem with like the Drupal 6 to Drupal 7 release was like Drupal 7's out, and then it was a very long time before Drupal 7 actually has all its modules that you can use to move on. And same with the Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 sort of step. And so now 8 to 9 was the first leap that we had where it should have been smooth, and this was a way to kind of show how smooth it was going to be. And so what it is it's a process that runs and does the static analysis and runs the director stuff to generate patches across all projects that Drupal.org hosts for Drupal 8 and now for Drupal 9 to check for Drupal 10. And so it's sort of it kind of goes back to that same centralized versus individual developer CI system where it's project quality metrics on every project on Drupal.org all at once. And so the nice thing is we might be able to leverage this infrastructure to kind of learn more about the projects that we have and come up with better quality signals to analyze the projects, make it easier for people to decide which projects are the right ones to use just by examining them with all these static analysis tools and figuring out, do they meet the coding standards? Do they meet this? Do they meet that? And so, it's a Docker container that runs on Kubernetes on EKS. It runs on some relatively large nodes so that we can run, 30-something, like 32 Git clones at a time in parallel. One thing we discovered along the way is we don't want to run too many because we actually DDoS our own infrastructure by loading too many things too quickly. So I found out that I don't.
And I promise you that's not what we did this morning. But
turns out we don't need to check out 128 projects at a time in parallel. That's too much, too frequently. So, but yeah, anyways, it's basically a process that bulk processes every single thing on Drupal.org to give us intelligence and data about it. And the stuff that we're using it for right now is the deprecation data and to find out how ready things are for Drupal 10 and to give people like Gabor the tools to nudge maintainers, be like, hey, all you need is this one little patch, and it becomes Drupal 10.
Yeah, and Gabor and other folks who are really leading the Drupal 10 readiness initiative, these kinds of tools really exist to sort of accelerate the work they're doing and to give them the data they need to make those sort of key decisions. So, on this slide, we can sort of see that right now we actually have more than 50% of the project scanned would be Drupal 10 compatible already, they have no deprecations. They just need an info YAML change. Now, there may still be deprecations introduced before 10's release. We're not quite there yet, but it is exciting to see that, like, hey, a lot of this stuff is actually already fairly close. And we can already start to see what are the most common uses of deprecated code so that the Palantir team can go back with Drupal Rector and say, hey, let's write some rectors that'll automatically solve the top 10 most commonly used deprecations. Let's go from there and have a brief chat about authentication. So this goes back a little bit to Git Lab, GitHub, contribution tools, Drupal spoons, all these kinds of conversations. And we'll talk more about this. You'll hear a message about this actually in the Dries note on Wednesday, about making contribution easier, particularly for folks who are brand new. It's kind of top of my mind that at this DrupalCon, we know there's something like 35%, maybe 40% brand new to DrupalCon attendees, not necessarily new to Drupal. But we'd love for those people to be able to contribute more easily. And so one of the things that we know is a factor is the difficulty it takes to figure out how to actually get started contributing, right? So all these improvements we've made with merge requests and issue forks have been really, really powerful. And for anybody who's an existing contributor who's tried them out, I think it's like a 10x improvement in the ability to get a change made. But if you're starting from not having an account at all, it can actually be fairly confusing to figure out, gosh, here I am browsing a repository or a project page, but actually I need to go create an account, and then I need to accept the Git access agreement, and then I need. So one of the things that we're not 100% sure we can absolutely do, but we really want to look into doing, is figuring out how to smooth out that new account creation process, and whether we can offer a create an account starting with your GitHub login, and knowing that hopefully that those are trusted accounts, that we can skip some of these extra validation steps or things like that. So this would be super early. This is just kind of an exploratory conversation, but it's something that we'd like to do, and it's related to wider community conversations about, hey, we also want to make your Drupal.org account kind of a centralized point of identity that could be used outside of Drupal.org. We want you to be able to sign into campsites with it, or chat services, or different things like that, so that we know that webchick on Drupal.org is webchick on this chat service, is webchick on a Drupal camp website, those kinds of things.
And that's super important, so that for things like the Drupal code of conduct, because if we know who people are, it makes our life so much easier for managing that type of stuff.
Yeah, it helps because our community, we're lucky as a community that we're as centralized as we are, but we're still not 100% centralized. We still use a variety of tools. We meet in a variety of places. We have both local and global ways of interacting with each other. And that ability to manage authentication helps us bridge the gap between the local and the global, and sort of sub-segmented spaces and the larger spaces. I'm still watching our time, and I want to leave more room for questions, but I'm going to run through our next topic. I think we still have a little bit of time. I want to talk partly about spam and bad actor defense, because it relates kind of to our authentication question. One of the things you might ask is, like, why do we have a confirmed user process? Like, why is there that green button for people to click to say, hey, that's a real person? Or why do you occasionally get a CAPTCHA request when you're browsing Drupal.org, or any of these sorts of things? And that's because, unfortunately, Drupal.org is a major spam target, and there's a lot we kind of have to do to deal with it. So there's some recent events around some of the tools we use. Currently, we're using Distill Networks for registration protection. Distill was recently, well, not even super recently, acquired by Imperva, and so some things are changing. We also use Perimeter X for sort of bot detection and blocking, and serving some of this CAPTCHA stuff. Ryan, maybe you could just briefly give a little overview of, like, not the tool specifically, but kind of the architectural idea behind how we do this sort of bad actor detection.
Right. Fundamentally, the bad the bad stuff that we're trying to stop is user-generated content, and we don't allow anonymous user-generated content on Drupal.org. So we've spent a lot of focus time on preventing bad user accounts from being created. And so our distill tool was the one that allowed us to kind of figure out how to restrict it to, oh, you want to create an account? That's great. Oh, you want to create 30 accounts? No, we're actually going to stop that. And so, and then Perimeter X was the other tool that allowed us to kind of sense the rest of the actual bad bot behavior. So preventing bad content and spam from getting on Drupal.org really boiled down to preventing a lot of user accounts being created. And it also helps our metrics too, so that we can understand when people are like, oh, the community used to be growing leaps and bounds, and now it's not as much. And it's like, well, no, it used to be growing by leaps and bounds of spammers. The actual real number is buried inside of there somewhere, so we don't actually have good metrics on, community growth and stuff and health if we,
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the difficult things, unfortunately, is spam prevention is kind of an arms race. As much as we do to try and prevent things, people start working around it. And in a lot of cases, it isn't. Thanks, Mike, for the Rolex watches link in chat. No, in a lot of cases, it isn't really just bots, right? There are places that are essentially humans with large numbers of devices and different kinds of proxies, and they're doing a bunch of actions across a bunch of devices all at once, and trying to detect those sorts of things gets even more difficult. So sadly, some of these tools are changing. It's difficult. For example, the Distill Networks registration protection tool we're using is being sunsetted by Imperva. We're going to have to find a replacement. So this is actually an area where if anybody listening to this, either live or during the recording, has some thoughts or ideas, you could find us in the Drupal infrastructure channel in Drupal Slack and maybe help us out. And perhaps even make it a little bit more of an easier user experience with some of those tools too. All right, continuing to move along, just in the interest of time, I do want to continue to talk about contribution recognition. And there's some important topics here. We've said in previous DrupalCons that we have some upcoming improvements to the contribution recognition system to help recognize more types of contribution related to the work that the Contribution Recognition Committee has done. For various reasons, that has kind of been delayed and shifted around a little bit, but there's certainly some more things that we would like to do. Here you can kind of see what the existing attribution workflow looks like, right? So for those of you who maybe don't use the Drupal.org issue queues, this might be new, but probably you've seen this before, which is that when you're making a comment on an issue, you can specify that you're doing it as a volunteer, you're doing it on behalf of an organization, or you're doing it on behalf of a customer or a client, or any combination of those things, right? You can sort of put all of those sorts of things together. And then once you've said it once, it kind of can stay that way, and that's sort of your default for future comments that you make. And you can go back and edit it if you need to. This has been an invaluable tool in understanding the makeup of our contribution ecosystem, in understanding what organizations sponsor their employees to be contributors, and understanding who our individual contributors are, especially our non-code contributors who come in and they have no commits, but they've been active in all sorts of places doing usability reviews or documentation or all sorts of other things. And there's further improvements we can make. What's interesting, though, is that as we look at adopting, say, more parts of the Git Lab suite, this is the kind of thing that we don't want to lose. And so myself and our executive director, Heather, have spoken to the team at Git Lab, and there is currently an issue, a Git Lab issue on gitlab.com at this address. Maybe someone can type that out in the chat for me, which is for essentially replicating Drupal-style contribution attribution into GitLab's issue system. It's unclear if that's something that they would adopt, but there is some enthusiasm from some of the internal folks over there. And if it did happen, it would open up some more possibilities in terms of looking at what we could do with some GitLab tools. So wanted to highlight that. And then I'd like to use our remaining 10 minutes on some specific topics and some Q&A. So let me introduce the next topic and then hand it over to Rachel for part of this. So this relates to a question I see in our Q&A about the fact that Drupal.org and most of our subsites are still on Drupal 7. Groups in particular is still on Drupal 6. Yikes. And what are we going to do about that? What's our plan for future migrations? How are we going to update things? What's going on? So I'm going to go through a few just sort of visual aids. Do you want me in the background, Rachel? Should I do that first?
I don't know how you want me to hop in, actually.
Okay, well, I'll do this first then. So let's first of all talk about what we have. So right now, if you use groups.drupal.org, it is a 6 site. It is pretty out of date and hard to use compared to what people are used to, but it still serves a purpose and a valuable one for folks. On that site, any self-organized group can kind of set up their group homepage. You can list the organizers, you can list upcoming events. Lately, what's happened mostly is it's been a place to have a sort of central, almost just a place to notify people of things. But then if you have a group like Drupal Providence or something like that, what they might also do is set up something like a meetup.com page where they actually do sort of registration for their events, and they cross-post it to groups or cross-post it to other places, right? They may, in addition to this, local organizers may also have things like a camp website that they're hosting themselves. This is New England Drupal Camp. All of these kinds of things might come together. So as we look to replace groups, one of the things that we're thinking about is the ways that people are actually organizing now, right? And this is where we'd be interested in your feedback and your thoughts, because one of the things we've built is a new community events aggregator, which is less focused on being an event platform and more focused on just capturing the information and putting it in one place. So Rachel, maybe you can talk about community events, where that comes into play and what we've built there.
We wanted to spend some time working with a new and upcoming thing called the Event Organizers Working Group and find ways to make it so that everybody, both inside the Drupal community and close to us, so people who we are trying to attract into the Drupal community, could find things happening in their locality, know about them in a nice, easy, one-stop shop place to go, which was a primary desire. So we began to create a listing at drupal.org/community/events that would do that. The Event Organizers Working Group also said that what they wanted was an ability to get some statistics from events so that we can all learn from each other and also plan ahead so that we could tell each other where we are proposing within the year to have our events. So Drupal Camp London usually happens January or February. I've got snowed in with it before. Drupal Camp Florida happens later in the year. DrupalCon Europe happens in the autumn. DrupalCon North America happens in the spring, etc. So being able to plan those around. So we have this listing and we're getting to the point where people can discuss with each other and upload statistics like who was sponsoring, who was speaking, who was providing code of conduct support, all these types of things. Of course, once we've got that data, we can then begin to give contribution credit automatically for people doing those things, which is another way of giving credit to people and organizations, which we see as useful.
Yeah. And I think one of the things to point out about this is what the Events Organizers Working Group is made up of a number of different people. You'll meet them probably here at the event. You'll likely hear about them a little bit more in the introduction to the Dries note, because I think we're going to be talking about this a little bit more then. But for example, this set of listings hosted on Drupal.org can now also feed DrupalCal. So they're actually, the feed here is being consumed and pulled into DrupalCal. So that's what you used to use, those map pins and that way of finding your thing is now fed from a central D.O location. So all this stuff, the idea is to make sure that there's one central place to check this data. But at the moment, what this does, as you can see, is it gives you a place to talk about an event and to maybe to link off to, again, a greater site about it or things like that. But does that cover most of what you need? Groups.drupal.org also has interest groups that aren't organized around events happening at a certain time, right? So how important are those? How should we think about replacing those sorts of things? Those are the sorts of questions that we kind of want to ask all of you. So when it comes to sort of finishing the replacement of groups.drupal.org, your input and the input of those listening to this on recording is going to be important. I know, sadly, I meant to have the link handy for the groups.drupal.org issue, but if you do have thoughts, we'll paste that link in and at some point here, or you'll be able to find it on Drupal.org later. We have about 3.5 minutes left, so I did want to be able to answer some questions.
And yeah, this sort of process we're going through with groups.drupal.org, that's the start of the migration process, simplifying what we have so we don't have to migrate it. We're doing that in other places, like the association website membership is off that now. And
right.
Yeah, easiest migration is
exactly.
no migration. So anything that we can get rid of or otherwise not migrate, that'll simplify the process. And we're also working on some more like foundational stuff, like upgrading the PHP version and taking some of the things we learned from hosting containers with Drupal Steward to modernizing our hosting infrastructure so it's more flexible to be ready for Drupal 9 and 10.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess I'm mostly just reiterating what Neil just said, but the basis of our current Drupal 9 sort of migration plan is that simplification. It's eliminating the subsites we can eliminate, simplifying features, removing things that we do custom in favor of things where we can rely on tools, whether that's more of the Git Lab tooling stack or other components. There'll be a little bit more that speaks to resourcing on the engineering team related to developer tools and other projects, again, at the Dries note. So I'm trying not to spoil everything that's going to come up there, but I would definitely check that out as well. Looking for additional questions and comments in the Q&A in the chat. So again, that Q&A button in the right-hand sidebar you can use if you have some questions to ask here. One question was, is there a way with respect to the Drupal Steward program to just get the WAF rules or access to containers where it have it pre-configured? On like an individual site basis, no, because we need to, that could effectively leak the vulnerability and we can't manage a circle of trust to a huge number of individual sites, hence the fact that we're hosting a service where you can route the site, your domain through it and then to your site as a way to get that protection. On a larger infrastructure scale, if you manage a significant amount of sites, we do have partner levels where we can work with that, and that's what we're doing with Acquia and Pantheon sites and site customers. If you're on one of those platforms, by the way, as far as I know, it's set up so that all of their customers are just protected by what you have already. There isn't an extra step that you need to take, but you can reach out to them directly if you
yeah, and I believe that's active right now for them. So yeah, any highly critical vulnerability, yes. Like the ones we expect that will be exploited within hours or sooner of a security release.
That is correct.
Exactly. And we've, in fact, we activated this for a critical release that happened back in November, I think it was. There's a blog post on Drupal.org if you want to go back and look at it that talks about what it meant to activate Drupal Steward for one of those core critical vulnerabilities. Yeah, to your question, Alex, I would reach out to me directly, Tim at association.drupal.org. is a great way to check that out. Just checking the chat here. Oh, I think we're actually pretty much out of time, but I think we got to all the questions. You're certainly welcome to reach out in the Drupal Org channel in Drupal Slack, the Drupal infrastructure channel. You can also find us on the association staff page on Drupal.org. Again, we're sort of the engineering team behind the scenes that keeps all of Drupal.org up and running and all of those development tools that help the community build Drupal. That's what we're here to do, and it's what we love doing day in and day out. And we can't do it without your support, whether that support comes in the form of feedback on features, thank yous on Twitter, Drupal Association membership, or advocating for a supporting partnership with your employer. All of those things really help out the engineering team and enable us to keep doing what we're doing. So thank you again. We'll say goodbye for now, and I hope you enjoy the rest of DrupalCon week. I believe we're now switching over into contribution time, so I do hope that all of you will check out the contribution platform and find opportunities to give back to Drupal using some of these cool tools that we've just talked about.
Thank you.
All right,
if
thanks very
anybody
much.
wants to do some mentoring this week, I'm running a mentor orientation in about 15 minutes. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks all.